Шановні колеги, вітання. Ми продовжуємо.
Welcome you. We're going to continue our work. We're going to talk about the presentation of the results of the Ukrainian total. Regarding the torturing, we have Tetiana Mazur, Director of the Amnesty International in Ukraine, Bohdan Ovcharuk, the speaker person of Amnesty International in Ukraine, and Serhiy Govoruha, Director of the Ukrainian Office of International Research Agency, IFAK Institut. You have the floor, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much, colleagues, to join us in our press conference. Today, the world marks International Day of supporting the torture victims. This day was actually established by the UN back in 1997 in order to once again remind about those commitments and obligations undertook by the different countries regarding the Anti-Torture Convention. Unfortunately, still the tortures are widespread in the world. Ukraine is no exception, where Amnesty International for a long time now has been registering the tortures on the part of the state. Since 2005, we've been documenting the cases of tortures on the part of the militia. Also, we use the brutal force and the tortures on the part of law enforcement officers. In the course of ATO, we recorded the tortures and other war crimes committed by both parties involved in the conflict. Of course, there are different motives, but all the cases are united by the lack of responsibility of those for whom the brutal force is a kind of law. We repeatedly submit the recommendations to Ukraine, kind of measures steps should be taken in order to resolve the problem associated with tortures. We accompany our recommendations with an analysis of Ukrainian practices and the comparison with international law, and provide and describe the cases, information on some of the victims of tortures. But this time we decided to get to know what's Ukrainians' attitude towards the tortures, how often they come across tortures, and what they think how we can resolve this problem. For that case, we ensured the following. A few words about the methods used or techniques used in our study. My colleague Serhiy will tell you. A few words about how we gathered the information data. This is all Ukraine representative nature study. We collected data in the period since 10 through 18 June, and we polled 1,800 Ukrainians who represent the adult persons of Ukraine in the age brackets from 18 to 65 years of age, different. And the selective the method we use allows us to have error plus minus 3%. So the figures which we'll see on the screen, they are quite accurate and with good allow, let's say, acceptable error in which they should reflect the today's attitude of Ukrainians towards the problems of brutal force and cruel behavior and tortures. Thank you, Serhiy. I can sincerely tell you when we saw the results of this study, we were really astounded at how big a problem in Ukraine is associated with the tortures. Can you see that 2/3 of Ukrainians believe that tortures and the cruel attitude definitely or more likely than not are used by the law enforcement officers, and only 1/3 believes that there is no such violation of law as tortures or whatever. And many of the Ukrainians, either directly or indirectly, encountered the tortures. 7%, let's say themselves, 7% more their relatives, and the 20% their friends or acquaintances, and 1/3 are afraid of being subject to the cruel attitude or tortures when being detained by the law enforcement bodies. The fact that every third Ukrainian is afraid of the tortures in case of being detained by the law enforcement shows the impossibility for this country to take care of this issue inside in this state. You can see here that among those who condemns the application of tortures under any circumstances are 71% of Ukrainians, though 27% of the respondents partially justify the use of tortures in the context of committing especially severe crimes, and if the security of the state is threatened or when it's associated with the combating terrorism. Ukraine actually joined a lot of international instruments, European Convention on Human Rights and the Anti-Torture Convention, which actually call upon complete prohibition of tortures, including combating terrorism and other severe crimes. Well, unfortunately, with much regret, we have to state that among Ukrainians there is a certain level of tolerance towards tortures. About 48% they believe inadmissible the tortures during the ATO, and actually 71 they condemned. They condemned beyond that operation, beyond the boundaries of that operation. This only proves how insufficient are the actions on the part of the state in preventing torture. This is a very bad signal which requires from the state to demonstrate a very compromise-free position regarding the prohibition of tortures. Our research or our study also includes a very important modular block related to the actions of the law enforcement bodies during the protest meetings. 73% believe that the law enforcement used the extra forces, unjustified forces during the Maidan events, and 53% believe that they used torches and very brutal force. And many Ukrainians do not see any kind of difference between the situation with the tortures or the brutal force 1 year after the Maidan. We also registered the excessive force application and brutal practice during the Maidan events. While only 2 law enforcement officers were punished for the violation of law, we can state the systematic impotence on the part of the power to establish the justice for those who suffer from those brutal practices. Now I give the floor to Tetiana Mazur, who will tell you how Ukrainians treat the reforms in the law enforcement agencies or system. Good afternoon. In fact, we have to say that tortures and other brutal practices kinds or inhuman practices is a specific violation which is must be absolutely prohibited under any circumstances, as Bohdan mentioned. Even in the complicated situation where combating terrorism, whatever crimes are committed, the tortures or brutal practices must not be applied. There is no exception to that rule. However, in addition to that, the absolute prohibition of tortures or inhuman practice or what is detrimental to dignity of human beings should be balanced with the punishment or lack of punishment for such crimes. So this prohibition would be, in this case, perceived as a illusory one or absolutely no prospect, having no prospects. And since many of the top officials remain unpunished, this will only add water to that watermelon. We actually ask the Ukrainians, what's your attitude towards the response on the part of the state to application of tortures and other forms of brutal practice? 72% of those polled said that they were sure that for tortures and brutal practice, the law enforcement officers must always be responsible. 76% believe that the state has to exert all possible efforts in order to bring to responsibility those who are guilty of tortures or any kind of other kind of brutal practice under any circumstances while implementing reforms or any operations under any circumstances. Only 5% of the citizens of Ukraine believe that law enforcement officers always bear responsibility for the application of tortures and other kinds of brutal practices. While each fifth citizens believe that law enforcement officers never are punished for such actions. This absolutely coincides with our experts' assessment, since for a long time we've been talking about the absence of the punishment for law enforcement officers for the tortures and other brutal practices. And the most graphic example may be the Euromaidan, European Maidan, where violations were obvious. We are all eyewitnesses such violations, and unfortunately, more than a year has elapsed since the end of the Euromaidan, and we can state that the investigation of the Euromaidan case is inefficient. Coming back to the standard of the absolute prohibition of tortures and other kinds of brutal practices and its two components, to refrain from tortures, and the second element, to, in case tortures took place, to investigate the matter. We can say that for the violations during Maidan, responsibility should be shared by the previous authorities who actually allowed those violations, and also the powers that be, the present authorities who didn't manage to punish those who were guilty and to bring the justice for those who suffered last winter. Very interesting that 53% believe that the prosecutor's offices are responsible for the investigation of the complaints, for application of the tortures and other brutal practices by the law enforcement officers. So 53% of the people believe that the prosecutors' offices do not cope with their duties. They named the reasons, among the reasons, corruption, the lack of the political will, imperfections in the Ministry of the Interior, and a lack of competence in the investigative bodies. Also, we'd like to remind you that there is a number of the criteria worked out regarding the efficiency or effectiveness of the investigation. What kind of investigation should be introduced for the facts of torture and other brutal practices? They are mentioned in the rulings of the European Human Rights Court, and those criteria are independence, unbiased, impartiality, competence, involvement, and control over the matter by the public at large. It is difficult to implement, but it is necessary to implement those. Analyzing the answers we received from those polled, from the residents of Ukraine, I would like to say that Ukrainians are rather more likely optimists, and they did not lose all the trust in the authorities, and they believe that the reform in the law enforcement bodies will change the situation with the tortures. Also interesting that Ukrainians define for themselves some of the priorities which has to be changed in order for the reforms to be efficient and bring some fruit. Fighting, combating corruption, fighting the lack of punishment, elimination of the conflict of interest, and setting up of the independent investigation body, enhancement of the punishment for the violation of the laws, and etc. Very interesting, many interesting ideas was by Ukrainians regarding this reform. Also interesting is that we put a very specific question. We have been a long time we've been saying, in order to fight this lack of punishment, we have to set up independent body for investigation of, let's say, of the violation committed by militiamen, for example. And we asked them the question about that. 65% agreed with us that it is necessary to do that. I should mention here that the Investigation Bureau, the National Bureau of Investigation is provided for by the special code, and the Parliament made a few steps towards this establishment. This bureau, it has been registered, the draft law in Parliament. It was adopted in first reading, but I would like to emphasize that just setting up a new body is not the panacea. This will not resolve the existing problem, because this body has to meet the requirements of carrying out the investigation, must be provided with the necessary resources. Bohdan already mentioned the tortures in the ATO zone. Our organization actually paid attention to those facts. First time we did that in June 2014, and the latest study we published in May 2015. We actually record the facts of tortures on the part of both parties involved in the conflict. We also asked the Ukrainians about that subject matter, and here, despite the fact that 71% of the polled persons were categorically against the application of tortures, when we started to talk about the ATO zone, which is very difficult context, this figure changed. Only 48% of Ukrainians said that tortures are inadmissible even in the ATO zone. To us, the human rights defenders, this figure is very small. In developed democratic country, this figure must be bigger. Another interesting thing is perhaps those figures are associated with the fact that very actively disseminated, spread this myth that the war doesn't have any law. I would like to emphasize that this is a myth. We have to eliminate this myth, and not only by law enforcement officers. We would like politicians and the top officials to also to eliminate that myth. We adopted a number of the Geneva Conventions. I mean, I'm talking about the international community, and whatever difficult situation we live through, we have to observe the requirements of international law, Geneva Conventions, and tortures through the prism of this international law is supposed to be a violation and a war crime. And again, war crimes which for committing which, by all means, we have to make persons responsible, those who are guilty of those violations. The overwhelming majority of those polled expressed their trust and confidence to International Criminal Court as a dependent international institution. I would like to remind you that the International Criminal Court is the standing institution located in The Hague, and based on the Roman law, which Ukraine is not part yet of, and they actually investigate the most brutal violations against humanity, war crimes, etc. And it's interesting that the investigation and the bringing to responsibility, you were talking about that question, so most Ukrainians express their confidence or trust towards the International Criminal Court. So there is this is an evidence of lack of trust to the Ukrainian justice system and Ukrainian court and law enforcement bodies. Those figures, well, actually my colleague Bohdan mentioned, we were pleasantly surprised by the figures we received and the results of our polling, but the public authorities, the MFA and the SBU of Ukraine, those who are responsible for implementation reforms, the General Prosecutor's Office, the Parliament, any representative of today's Ukrainian authorities has to get acquainted with the results of this polling and should be very much concerned over the results of those. If each third person was himself subjected to the brutal practice or tortures, or one of his acquaintances. 4% they were directly involved or suffered the tortures. This is something which we have to urgently change. It's not in vain that we decided also to put the question about Euromaidan. Euromaidan, if you remember its history, the overwhelming majority of the people joined the Euromaidan after the students' Maidan was actually brutally dissolved, so to say, and the people mostly took to the streets to protest against this cruel practice on the part of the authorities. Of course, now we have a different situation. There is our conflict in Ukraine, but the form of the law enforcement system, with the emphasis to abandon the terrorism and other brutal practices, overcoming or fighting the lack of punishment for law enforcement officers, must be one of the top priorities of the powers that be. Also, we would like to voice some of the recommendations. Recommendation number one is that the leaders of the state have to condemn, without any compromise, any tortures or any other kinds of brutal practices. They have to give a clear signal that such attitude or behavior is inadmissible in their statements, and through the active investigation bringing to responsibility of all those, absolutely all those who was involved in such attitude behavior. We also have to speed up the process of establishing the National Investigation Bureau as a body which can take care of the violations committed by the law enforcement officers, including the Minister of the Interior. Also, we have to provide this for this bureau necessary resources to make it efficient. And we have to heed the Ukrainians and ratify the Rome Statute to join the International Criminal Court. And we know, if you're talking about the International Criminal Court, this is going to be to be used as a preventive mechanism, because those who would like to apply tortures and other war crimes, if they knew about the presence of such international entity, they would think twice whether they should commit such crimes or actions. And this is actually stimulate the national law enforcement system, since the International Criminal Court acts as a complementary mechanism. They start their investigation only when the national system is not able or capable or doesn't want to take care of investigations using on their own. That's all. We would like to take your questions. Any questions on the part of a journalist? So please introduce yourself. Ukrainian Crisis Media Center regarding the polling, everything is clear in how you did that. But the question is how you monitor or record the cases of tortures in the ITO zone. You said that this takes place and both parties actually commit those violations. So I would like to have more specific figures on that. Monitoring is carried out in a very simple, by us in a very simple manner. We have a number of researchers who on a regular basis go to the ATO zone, and because each time when we conduct our studies, it's very important for us to communicate directly with those who fall victims to the violation of human rights, and very often this takes place on the territory of the ATO territory, actually on the occupied territory. So those trips and the missions are there, and taking interviews, we analyze the public information. This is so-called the office investigation or study. It's very difficult to hide something from anybody. A lot of information you can find in internet. Of course, we always check this information. We have special methods and techniques specifically developed for this purpose. And there are some of the persons who are constantly on the territory of ATO. We have some partner organizations here. We are talking about the public organizations and the OSCE CMM mission, and we analyze those data, but in order to coordinate those data, we always verify those. And it's very difficult to speak specifically about the figures, despite the fact that we have a team of researchers and they can go to the territory of the so-called DPR or LPR, or the adjacent territories adjacent to the occupied territory, at least until recently they had this possibility, but we still do not have enough personnel to talk in the language of figures. That's why when we are talking about our studies, we kind of monitor some specific trends and tendencies. Last June, we recorded a lot of information about, let's say, the applications and let's say in tortures of some of the persons. We have the representatives of the voluntary battalions. Also, we're talking to some of the officials. We took all the data. You know, when there was active combat in place, we also recorded the so-called non-selected shellings, and since the situation knows always changes, it's not a stable situation, try to react to that, to respond to that. In each study, we emphasize that we cannot give the accurate figures. We're not talking the language of figures. We are talking the language of some trends of tendencies. And general, let's say the general comment, even if it were not for the ATO operation, we never can provide the statistics because we do not have an access to the primary or initial information. This statistics must be taken care of by the law enforcement bodies. But actually we carried out this kind of study in order to understand to which extent the vision and the sentiments of Ukraine coincide with our expert findings. And we can see what we are talking about. Actually, this reflects the thought and the way of thinking of Ukrainian society. Thank you. Next question. News and television. I specifically work in the city of Donetsk, for example. For example, like myself, I have to go through the checkpoints and through passes. How you specifically work in this case, in Donetsk or Lugansk? And second question, speaking about the possibility of Ukraine to, in the near future, to ratify the Rome Statute, we know from history the United States always lobby against other countries to ratify this institute, and of course Ukraine needs United States assistance to reform the armed forces. What do you think? How soon Ukraine will ratify this statute? Thank you for your question. Answering your first question, our researchers, until recently, this was not a big problem to make our physical presence in those areas. Of course, there are some organizational problems or nuances how to get there, but there is enough people who provide this special assistance to both international journalists and reps of international organizations. And actually, we didn't have some big problems with that. To get either to Donetsk or Lugansk, they could freely move there. Well, there were some minor nuances. The situation has changed a bit since that time, because DPR recently issued an order according to which they prohibit. I'm afraid to maybe I will not quote. They prohibit the activity of international organizations. This order does not contain a specific or clear prohibitions. It's not clear what organizations are prohibited to act there or what is going to be prohibited. But to us, this is some means some difficulties, since we mentioned that we criticize all the parties involved. In those the terrorists, separatists, for the violation of human rights. And there is some response to that. They at least try to pretend that they trying to hit us, and over there the situation is much more difficult. We do know that the United States have not ratified the Roman Statute. They did not join the International Criminal Court, and our organization, Amnesty International, criticized bitterly the government of the United States. But it seems to me that if you're talking about the International Criminal Court, those countries do not join this court who perhaps fear that they have something to become responsible for those crimes committed which are within the scope of attention or competence of the International Criminal Court. I do not have any explanation of that. The International Criminal Court, this is the unique structure which has been established in order for the humankind to understand that the conflicts have been, there have been a lot of those conflicts in the heinous violations like the World War II, but that was not perhaps the last war in the history of humankind. In order to become certain that we are talking about that those people who are guilty of the deaths of hundreds of thousands of human lives, we have to make sure that those people will be punished. For example, there was a special tribunal for Yugoslavia conflict. Then they decided that since the conflicts are galore, a lot, I mean, and let's establish a single body or agency which will take care of, let's say, real very difficult situations. In one of those very interesting quotations, and then sometimes it's easier to punish those who killed 5 or 10 people than those who are guilty of the deaths of hundreds of thousands of the victims. And this is some of the matters which will be taken care of by the International Criminal Court. When Ukraine joined that court, we often say that this is a must for Ukraine to do that, or to ratify the Rome Statute. We would like to emphasize this is not only the commitment or obligation, this means also some additional advantages and benefits for Ukraine, which is going to join the club of the countries who agreed between themselves to fight for the lack of the punishment for those who are guilty of the heinous crimes in the humankind history. And if Ukraine ratifies the Roman Statute and joins the international criminal situation, not only it improves the situation inside Ukraine, which is definitely natural, but also will improve the situation in other countries of the world. We do not like to compare countries or situations inside different countries, but objectively speaking, what's going on in Syria is much more terrible as compared to what is going on in Ukraine. And we hope we'll never have this situation here. But in order to prevent that, we have to ratify the Roman Statute. In continuation with the topic we were talking about now, like in different countries, the territory of the former Soviet Union, what countries, the former Soviet countries, joined the Roman Statute? Georgia and Moldova, if not mistaken, it seems to me they also ratified that statute. I will rephrase, modify your question. If you're talking about the countries members of the Council of Europe, not European Union, but Council of Europe, those who did not ratify this statute, Azerbaijan, Armenia, and the Russian Federation. What club you would like to join? So again, this is the question. Ukraine is talking about its European choice. So where is this European choice in this case? Thanks a lot, Tetiana. More questions or specifications, comments? If not, once again, thanks a lot for your for sharing the results of your studies. It was very interesting to hear some statistics and what would be the choice of Ukraine. This brings us to the end of this pre-briefing. Our next briefing at 1400 sharp. Thank you.